Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the end of the year. And if this is the year 2762, I'm making this particular video in December of 2022. It's time for the end of year roundup stuff. And we begin with Bitchfest 2022. This is the time where I get, I always complain, but this is the time where I really get to complain, where I just take a completely impressionistic, subjective opportunity to whine and carry on about things that annoy me. And some people are entertained by things that annoy me. No accounting for taste, is there? Anyway, so this particular Bitchfest consists of the 10 most underrated great composers. Now, if somebody's acknowledged as a great composer, how can they be underrated? Well, they can be. They can be because classical music, as I've pointed out many times, depends for its existence on time. Time spent listening, time spent dedicated to the work of these composers. So even though historically they may have a reputation, or we may acknowledge their greatness because there's one piece we play regularly, they're like one-shot wonders or two or three-shot wonders, they've written a wonderful body of work that people just dismiss, ignore, pay very little attention to. And so this is my list of the 10 most underrated great composers. You remember the last Bitchfest 2021 was the 10 most overrated recordings. So these are all going to be overrated, underrated, or maybe other subjects. We'll see what I have to bitch about in 2023. But for now, here we go. The list is down below, and you can look at it if you'd like, but I would really appreciate it if you'd actually listen to the video too before you comment. In any case, you can also, be as bitchy as I am. It's perfectly fine. It's one of the reasons we do this, to vent. And I'm venting. Number 1, Gluck. Gluck is one of those guys. I never knew what a Gluck was. Do you remember how when you used to go to these old concert halls and they have the names of the composers around, and there's it's Bach and Brahms and Beethoven and Mendelssohn was always there. And Gluck. And I would look at that and say, what the hell was Gluck? And then you look him up and he said, he was the guy who reformed opera. He took the old Baroque style of singer-based da capo aria, florid, highly ornamental opera, and he banished all of that, and he wrote austere, simple, boring operas that were revolutionary and that other composers did much better because they built on what he achieved, and that was that. Well, boy, is that not true. Yes, he was one of music's great reformers, but you don't listen to somebody because they reform something. You listen to something because they write great music. That's the only thing that matters. And Gluck wrote great music. And when I finally started listening to it, I was amazed. Absolutely amazed. He didn't reform it so that he could write boring, uninteresting, austere, stripped-down nothings. He did it so he could write swift-paced, passionate, exciting, intensely emotional dramas. And that's what he did. And I got news for you. He started out doing the old Baroque stuff, and those aren't so bad either. There's some amazing stuff in those operas. But like most composers of the day, he reused everything a million different times. Today, if anyone listens to Gluck at all, it's usually some transcription of the Dance of the Blessed Spirits from Orfeo, or maybe his Dance of the Furies from Orfeo. That's it. Nobody pays attention to anything else. Oh, what we're missing. It's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. I'll tell you how I got into Gluck. It's a very interesting story, actually. As some of you may know, I have been, I've done some musicological work on performance practice, and particularly the use of vibrato in orchestral string sections. And one of the things that always struck me as kind of kooky about the period instrument insistence, that it was just an ornament, used sparingly, bloppity, bloppity, blop. It's all wrong, everything they say, but it's okay. And demonstrably wrong, by the way. They don't have any proof, and the original sources tell us they're wrong, but that's another issue entirely. But I said to myself, there's some composers I noticed looking at scores who indicate that vibrato should be used in orchestral music, and some who don't. And I just was thinking to myself, where would I find it? Where would I find somebody indicating the use of vibrato? It would be at moments of great emotional expression, passion, tragedy, love and death, and, that kind of stuff, right? And it would be going back in musical history where, notation was kind of sporadic and inconsistent, and you never knew what was coming and what it meant. I said to myself, who should I look at? And I just was just a theory because I didn't know anything of Gluck's music, but I figured if Gluck really got rid of all these da capo arias and wrote through composed opera that was mostly accompanied, what we would call accompanied recitative or arioso, that is, the singing goes with a consistent orchestral accompaniment, which is what he did, then maybe he would be one of those guys because he was into extreme emotional situations, and I should look at his scores. So I started looking at his scores, and lo and behold, he notated vibrato all over the place for the whole orchestra, for the singers, for everybody. It was really crazy. And he was a real slob when it came to his scores. They're a mess. His additions are a mess. It's just a disaster in terms of, musicological, efforts to try and find clean additions. But he marked the emotion. He was very specific when it came to verbal indications of what to do and in terms of playing indications for some of the parts. And sure enough, there they were. There was vibrato everywhere. And he's an absolute lesson in the notation of vibrato and why musicians can't make generalizations about, when it was and wasn't used, because he would write a score that had vibrato all over the place. And some versions of that score had none, and some had it indicated. What does that mean? It doesn't mean they weren't using it. It means that they were, but that some composers notated it and some didn't, and it was up to the players to do what they wanted to do. But in general, if a singer is saying, I tremble with fury or with fear or with passion, or they're trembling all over the place, yeah, that's what the musicians would do too when they play the same music. You would wiggle. And that's how I got into Gluck. And then just looking at scores, so I started listening to the music. And my God, it was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I mean, Alceste, wow, that's incredible. The Iphigenia operas in Aulis, in Tauride, in Brooklyn, and wherever she was. Oh my goodness, it's amazing. They're just fantastic operas. And I can't account for their neglect. I mean, if people would stop thinking of him as a dull historical pedant and start listening to him as a real composer, holy mackerel. I mean, you could just do amazing things with him. So Gluck is definitely one of those underrated great composers. The next was actually a colleague and friend of Gluck. It's Boccherini, who I've talked about a lot in these videos. Boccherini was a genius, and his great deficit is that, first of all, he was sort of in Spain, which was a backwater. So he didn't get the attention that he deserved, although his music was published mostly in Paris. Second of all, he wrote mostly chamber music, which is a niche in the classical music world generally. And so, I mean, there are no operas. There is one. There's a Zarzuela, actually, but and a bunch of arias, but not much else. And so it's mostly chamber music. There's 30 some odd symphonies, a pile of cello concertos, and that's it. That's his output, but it's huge. Hundreds of string quartets and quintets and other things. He invented the string sextet, the string quintet. He was one of the pioneers of string quartet writing, but the biggest problem Boccherini had was that he was Italian, and music history and musicology and music theory is German. And, they hate Italians, and they're jealous of the Italians. They're jealous of the Italians because the Italians wrote tunes. They wrote operas. They were the singers. They were the people that everybody loved. They were the populists in music, and the Germans just hated them and dismissed them at every possible opportunity throughout the 19th century, which is the legacy of musicology that we still have. Because the methodology, the way we study music, the way we describe it, the way we analyze it, Schenkerian analysis, it's all German. And as a result of that, after the 20th century, the avant-garde went crazy and everyone went atonal and all that. Nobody cares about Italian composers of instrumental music. And Boccherini is the biggest victim of that. because his music is fabulous, but it's not German. It's Boccherinian. I would even call it Italian. It's what he made of it. He was a genuine, amazing composer. And as I've said before, he was a musical sensualist. He was another vibratist, by the way. He indicated it all over the place. His scores are incredibly meticulous, very specifically marked, full of dynamic nuances and verbal descriptions, often at very low dynamic levels. He was interested in timbre, in texture, in sound, with small groups of string instruments, and they are extraordinary works if you appreciate the colors that he could get from these ensembles. And they're tuneful and lovely, and they follow no set prescription for form. And so he's unanalyzable by a lot of modern standards. And so people dismiss him, and he doesn't get listened to. And of course now, a ton of stuff has never been recorded. There's only now a complete critical edition in the works that's going to take 100 years to finish. It's a real issue. There are many things that militate against his greater acceptance, but that doesn't demean the quality of the music, which is simply extraordinary. So Boccherini is another one who deserves far more attention than he gets, and he was really an important composer historically. He's just not going to ever get, I think, his just desserts. But that's okay. We can listen to him anyway. Then another one who I talk about a lot, CPE Bach. CPE Bach was in his lifetime the great Bach. He was far more popular than his dad. And now, of course, historically, all of that's been switched around. His dad has been deified, and CPE is an epigon, somebody who, is one of those in-between composers. He was between the Baroque and the classical, and his music is very emotional. It was the emotional expressive style, but it's small scale, and it's spasmodic, and it is spasmodic, and it is rather small scale. And he, again, wrote mostly instrumental music. I mean, he had 50-some-odd keyboard concertos, but it's almost all keyboard music. And there's choral music and sacred music, which he didn't care about particularly, and which, aside from the Magnificat and a couple other works, isn't really major. But there's another guy who I was so interested in, so I wrote a book about him. And when I wrote the book, I had to listen to everything. And a lot of his music was only recently rediscovered in that huge Bach archive that was recovered from World War II, that was stolen by the Russians and dumped in Poland and finally returned to Germany. But he was a remarkably intelligent and fascinating composer. There's so much that we know about him in terms of what he said, what he thought, what he wrote about performance practice. He was really a remarkable, remarkable guy. He was one of the very first composers to make a living as a freelance composer, publishing his own music, which was quite an achievement. He collected portraits. He was really an interesting person, an upper middle class guy who made a living as a composer without making compromises. I mean, he said he did. He said he had to write down for his audience sometimes, but basically, he did not make compromises. His aesthetic was up here, and his standards were up here. And they were wonderful. Now, again, there's a complete edition being published by the Packard Humanities Institute, which they're making available free to anybody who wants to perform it. So you don't have to worry about mechanicals and copyright and whatnot when you make recordings, which is a big deal. And so there has been an explosion of recordings, including that Hensler CPE Bach edition, which has, 40, 50 CDs of stuff. It's just marvelous. Somebody really worth getting to know, and somebody who was historically acknowledged, but never played, never listened to, always dismissed. And, he was just as good as his dad. He just was different. You get to a point where comparisons, as I've always said, they're pointless. They don't mean anything. You compare one greatness to another greatness, one perfection to another perfection. It's like in mathematics. They're different size infinities. They're different sizes, but they're both infinity. So, right? So Bach CPE, Carl Philipp Emanuel, was amazing. Absolutely amazing. And he really deserves far more attention than he gets. He's starting to get it, I have to confess. Marc-Andre Hamelin did a disc of it. Mikhail Pletnev did a beautiful disc. Regular pianists are starting to have some fun with this music, as well they should, because it's enormously fun music. I mean, the concertos are great. They should be played more too. It's wonderful stuff. So CPE Bach is one. Next, let's move forward a little. Saint-Saëns. There are a lot of French composers who are great who don't get what they deserve because they were French, not German. And Saint-Saëns was really a composer of instrumental music, but he did everything. He wrote operas, he wrote ballets, he wrote big choral works. And, you know, Tovey rather dismissively called him the greatest composer who wasn't a genius, which was just such a snippy, snide thing to say. But Tovey was completely immersed in, you know, he drank the Kool-Aid. He was one of those German guys, you know, and the German classics were the epitome of music and everything else was second rate. That was his great failing as a critic and writer on music. However marvelously he wrote about that music that he loved. And Saint-Saëns was a composer mostly for us of instrumental music. And he wrote 5 symphonies. He wrote 5 piano concertos, which are marvelously underplayed and wonderfully wonderful works. 3 violin concertos, 2 cello concertos, lots of short works. He wrote string quartets and sonatas and just tons of really, really good music. And like so many of these composers, it was always at a very high level of pure craftsmanship. Saint-Saëns had no illusions about his ability. He did not regard himself as a transcendental genius. He said, anybody who doesn't understand the beauty, who can't be thrilled by simple chords expressing simple harmonies perfect only in their arrangement and their relationship to each other, does not understand music. That was his theory. And so, yeah, there was he had the element of a pedant about him in some ways. And that aspect of his personality, not so much the music, can be emphasized to the detriment of our experience of the music. But then you listen to the music and it's like beautiful. And it's never too long. And it's always emotionally true. And it's just good stuff. Really good stuff. But he also sort of falls in between the cracks in terms of 19th century aesthetics, because he was not a Beethoven versus, or, you know, Brahms versus Wagner guy. He was a friend of Liszt. He was who he was. He did everything. He was a polyglot and a very, very good one. And I just think he's marvelous. And I have to turn the heating off because that's what that whirring sound you hear is. So stay tuned and I'll be right back for the next in my Bitchfest. We've done 4. We have 6 to go. Okay, we're back with Bitchfest 2022. I got the heat off. You know, this is my new home, and it has forced air heating, which is fabulous. It warms the whole place up in like minutes, but it has a blower, and it makes a noise, so I had to turn it off. And I'm going to freeze my ass off while I finish this. It may make me bitch more quickly. So anyway, after Saint-Saëns, we have Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn, who I've also written a book about. I like writing books about underdogs, you know? I think they're more interesting sometimes than the big names, because they also have a million books written about them already. Mendelssohn was not the Victorian twit that people make him out to be. His reputation is the result of a combination of anti-Semitism, because although he was German, remember, he was Jewish, even though he grew up as a Protestant, and, you know, but the Germans, you know, didn't allow him to be German. There was one of the most appallingly frightening things I ever read was an essay by Furtwängler that was supposed to be a good essay. This is after World War II, after the, you know, Nazis and all that stuff. And Furtwängler was rehabilitating, and he wrote an essay or gave a radio talk or something on Mendelssohn, where he said, yes, Mendelssohn could actually be accepted as a German composer after all. And just the thought process behind that way of viewing music really, really turned me off to a degree that I find it very, very difficult to get over. It really is appalling. And Mendelssohn suffers from that. He still suffers from that. We still have the legacy of the judgments made of his music because of prejudice, because of our distaste for the whole Victorian musical aesthetic, in which Mendelssohn was practically deified again. And our reaction against that kind of music has affected Mendelssohn tremendously, his reputation. But he was a composer of amazing craftsmanship. He was the greatest musical genius since Mozart, maybe a greater one in some ways. He didn't live much longer than Mozart. He had a very similar trajectory in that he produced a large body of work and burnt himself out and died very, very young, very sadly. And but he doesn't even get credit for that. Usually composers get credit for like dying young and tragically. Well, Mendelssohn died young and tragically. He definitely did, but he was wealthy. He was successful. He did everything well. He wasn't shat on as when he was growing up. He had a life of privilege, and so for that reason also, there is such jealousy. I mean, none of this has anything to do with music. Do you notice? This is all biographical trivia. It's all completely irrelevant to what was going on inside him internally, his feelings, his passions, his belief in music, his aesthetics, his craftsmanship. I mean, he was taught from this tall to be to give 110% in everything he did, and he was good at everything. I mean, he could ride, he could swim, he could translate Greek as well as the Greeks. He was he was just a genius. And his music reflects that. It is extraordinary music. And yes, because he was highly influenced by Bach and Mozart and Beethoven, his music is not romantic crazy. It's romantic controlled. And some people also dislike controlled. They want crazy. Like Schumann was more crazy than Mendelssohn was in terms of his musical expression. But that doesn't, for me, that doesn't carry any weight with me. It really doesn't, because you have to appreciate these things for what they are, as long as they have the integrity, as long as they have that level of quality about them. And Mendelssohn's music does. And there are certain things he wrote that are just amazing. His string quartets are amazing. Several of the symphonies are amazing. Elijah is really the only great Victorian oratorio that we really care about. And it is. It's a great work. He didn't write operas, he didn't write ballets, but he wrote wonderful incidental music, obviously, A Midsummer Night's Dream, the overtures. He, originated tone poems like the Hebrides, his organ sonatas. I mean, no one cares about organ music, I know, but his organ sonatas are just about the only great works for that instrument between Bach and Franck. I mean, there's really, really fine music in there. The songs without words are much better than their parlor music reputation would lead us to believe. There's a real guy there. Serious musician of tremendous quality who deserves to be taken seriously. And I know some Mendelssohn scholars, actually, because I've met them at some of the musicological symposia and things that I've been at. And it was very, very interesting, because I started out poo-pooing them and later said, no, I was wrong. I was echoing what everyone else was saying, absent actual listening. I mean, just listen to Die Erste Walpurgisnacht. There's a piece nobody knows. I mean, it's a cantata. It's like 25 minutes long. It's thrilling. Oh, my goodness. It's atmospheric, and it's fun, and it's got a great story about Druids and, Christians fighting each other. And the Druids win, by the way. He was something special. And it's taken me a very, very long time to realize that, because you have to put the time in to listen. That's the lesson of this particular Bitchfest. And once you put the time in and you know what you know, you can complain about those who don't. Yeah, and that alone makes it worthwhile. So after Mendelssohn, we have to do Liszt. This is so much fun. Liszt is fun. Liszt is a composer who I only take quasi-seriously because he took himself so seriously, number one, and because he still arouses such a violent reaction in listeners. It's just marvelous. One of my classical music's 10 dirtiest secrets was Liszt is trash. That was one of my 10 dirtiest secrets. And some of you, it fascinates me how the lack of humor in so many of you people. I have to tell you, it's right, I could bitch about you too. Lighten up, would you? I say something like that, and I get people very serious who say, yes, I agree with you. That's absolutely true. Liszt is trash. And then I get the people who say, how could you say that? Oh, my goodness, you're a cretin. You're awful. How could you demean my dear Liszt guy? Actually, most people agreed with me than didn't, which shows you just how pervasive these prejudices are. Because that's all I was doing. I was merely stating a prejudice. I don't believe it. I mean, come on. What's the matter with you people who actually believe this silliness? We're just having a good time. We were playing around with received opinion. That's what we were doing. And challenging some others with that list of classical music's 10 dirtiest secrets. Well, a lot of Liszt is not trash. Liszt had genuine failings as a composer, and there's no harm in admitting them. He had no sense of timing. Musically, he really didn't. He would just go on forever because he was one of the greatest pianists who ever lived, maybe the greatest, and he was an improvisational genius. And one of the things about improvisation is that it tends not to have really strict or thought out forms. And you can keep on going forever if you're good at it. And Liszt could, and he did. And sometimes he did it on paper. So that's one thing you sort of have to get over. You just have to get over it to get to the good stuff. Then there was the fact that, his orchestration is kind of screechy in his orchestral music. It just is. And third of all, he was obsessed with this sort of transcendental sort of folderol that he thought he was doing in some of his more, there's this conflict between the sacred and the secular and in everything that he did. Just about everything. You have the Mephisto waltzes, and then you have, Angelus. You have his sacred music, which is terribly underrated, by the way. The Legend of Saint Elizabeth is a beautiful work. His oratorio, his Graner Mass is a glorious work. There's some beautiful, beautiful liturgical pieces that nobody does. But he was also not a tunesmith. He really wasn't. Some composers are, some aren't. He was definitely a not. He was best when he was using other people's tunes because he needed pre-existing material, like a jazz performer, like improvisational artists. They take something that exists and then they do something with it. That was Liszt. That's where he's at his strongest, in the Hungarian Rhapsodies, where he's using melodies that he picked up somewhere in his operatic paraphrases. But when he had to invent original melodies, as often as not, he had problems. He really had problems. And so did Wagner for that reason. They just weren't tunesmiths in the traditional sense. And that's another thing you just have to sort of get over. But why do we get over it? We get over it because he was a questing improvisational genius. When he really set his mind to it, for example, in the big B minor sonata, he could be amazing, formally fascinating. That's his most perfect piece in many respects, probably, but he only did it once. The symphonic poems are incredibly forward-looking and progressive as music, and they still are. They don't sound faded and old when you listen to them. They sound like really interesting experiments, some of which work and some of which don't. And there's a reason to listen to them for that reason. They're fun, and I think personally that there's a lot of value in listening to music with obvious defects, so you can get past them. So you know what they are. You can discuss them. You can talk about them. You can think about it. His music makes you think. It gives you something to chew on. It has substance in that sense, great substance, because whatever you may say about it being successful or failing or whatever it is, it's controversial and it's provocative. And that provocative quality challenges you when you hear it, no matter what. And that's an aspect of great music. It may not be an aspect of perfect music, but it's great stuff. And so Liszt, I think, is horribly misunderstood and, again, not listened to for the range of what he achieved, which is astonishing. You think about some of these composers. He was teaching, he was traveling, he was performing, and writing. How did they have time to do all this stuff? I used to worry about that. Then I made 2,000 plus videos up to this point, and I thought, well, I guess it's possible if you put the time in, But that's what Liszt did. He was amazing, and so yes, he is underrated and deserves to be treated more fairly, if not seriously. So after Liszt, Sir Arthur Sullivan. Oh my goodness, Arthur Sullivan, one of the greats, the greatest English composer who ever lived. I said that. Oh, the fun that ensued amongst the commentariat. Oh yes, but really, who's greater? Some of you said Vaughan Williams. Vaughan Williams is an extremely great composer. I would say he's as great as Sir Arthur Sullivan, quite frankly. I really would. But again, you're comparing greatnesses. Sullivan, there was no 19th century English composer who was as great as Sullivan, or Irish, or from the British Isles, or whatever you want to call them. I don't want to get into that. Do not start with me. It will not bode well for you if you do. So yes, Sullivan is amazing. Why is he amazing? He was incredibly popular and still is. He's the only English composer from that period, from any period, who's a household name. I mean, Handel being only adopted. And you have Sullivan. Who else is there? There's that too, isn't there? But he gets shat on because he wrote comedies. And comedy is always denigrated. Music which is tragic, music which is miserable, well, that gets valued. Oh yes, those are higher, more elevated thoughts and feelings. I think that's total crap. I think there is nothing more elevated than humor, and humor is much, much harder to do than tragedy. Tragedy's easy. You just kill someone. You just make them miserable. But humor requires timing. It requires wit. And when he teamed up with Gilbert, they created some of the greatest comedies in the history of Western art. And the music is everywhere inspired and supportive of the amazing texts. And that is really saying something. It really is. Sullivan was a fabulous tunesmith, an amazing tunesmith, an incredible orchestrator. And he has the success, gets the attention, but he doesn't get the respect. Even his serious opera, Ivanhoe, it's a very good opera. It really is. And Sullivan knew what he was about. He knew what he could do, and he did it supremely well. But even in his own lifetime, people were looking down on him, saying, "Oh, you have such talent. Why are you wasting it on comedy? On writing things that are popular, on music for the masses, horrible to grow up in that environment, horrible to grow up with that set of values." The fact that he achieved what he did as well as he did, well, that's really amazing. And so Sullivan is definitely one of the most undervalued, underrated of great composers. And really the British, who are so good at comedy, think Monty Python, think, Benny Hill. I mean, they really do well to value their musical comedy more than they do. And stop worrying about the fact that there wasn't some great tragic genius who was around in the 19th century. I mean, first of all, you can't get what you don't have, number one. And number two, it's even worse if it leads you to devalue what you do have, if what you have is astonishingly great. So, Sullivan, yes, next. We're in the last three. Rossini. Another composer who's incredibly popular. Of course, The Barber of Seville. He made it into cartoons. Rossini himself said, "I was really born for comedy. I was not made for expressing the deeper, more tragic emotions." Well, here's a newsflash. He was, and he did. It's just that nobody cares. I mean, the operas that he wrote at Naples are incredibly fabulous. Maometto Secundo is glorious. Ermione is one of the most gripping, tragic portraits that anybody ever did of anything, anytime. I mean, it gets so gripping that Rossini indicates vibrato in the vocal parts during the death scene. So there you go. Now, Rossini was an unbelievable type A personality. He was obsessive-compulsive. He burnt himself out initially when he was in his 30s, but then he reinvented himself and wrote a slew of gloriously fabulous small works, his Sins of Old Age. They're incredible pieces. His piano music is as great a body of piano music as anybody wrote the second half of the 19th century, and I stand by that. It is music of impeccable craftsmanship and range and wit and delight. My God, the man was gifted. And he started all over again. He had two separate careers. The second career is barely acknowledged. Finally, some pianists are starting to get their fingers into the piano music. It occupies 6 or 7 CDs worth of stuff. It's all been recorded, and those songs and chamber works and the Petite Messe Solennelle, these late works of his, they're fabulous. But just as fabulous are the non-comedy operas. of which there are more than a dozen. I mean, starting with Tancredi, which I mean people love, of course. It's beautiful because it has di tanti palpiti and all that stuff. But if you listen to those Neapolitan operas, they are wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And sure, there are the overtures and the string sonatas and other things that we liked instrumentally. But he could write, the man could write, and he could do any emotion that you want. I mean, Semiramide is a masterpiece. It's a Wagnerian length when you do the whole thing. And so people don't get much of an opportunity to hear it other than Bel Raggio and a couple sort of excerpts from it. But wow, what an amazing piece of music. And the guy was great. He was unbelievably admired in his lifetime. He was a wit. He was a gourmand. He had everything going for him. But, we only appreciate a sliver, a tiny, tiny sliver of what he achieved. And the magnitude of that achievement is unlikely to be acknowledged in the wider musical world because it consists either of operas, which are expensive and nobody wants to listen to them, or alternatively, chamber works and piano music. And so that tends to militate against great popularity or scholarly respect. Although Phil Gossett, the great late Phil Gossett, who was doing the Rossini critical edition, and I mean which is ongoing, by the way, there is still a lot that we don't know, a lot to uncover, a lot to listen to, and he is getting the scholarly respect he deserves in one branch of academia. But one of the problems with today's academia is that it's branched. It's very, very isolated and specialized, and so there's not a lot of back and forth and intermixing, and that's a shame because music is intermixed. Rossini was performed in Vienna. He was not the second Viennese school or the first Viennese school or a Viennese composer, but he was as popular there, more popular, as the first Viennese composers were. And composers of the day learned from him. And so it's ridiculous to segregate all of this stuff into little compartments that don't speak to each other and that don't want to acknowledge the value of what the other is doing. Rossini, definitely one of the most underrated of major composers. And now we have two left. Ready? Number one of the two left is Dvorak. Yeah, Dvorak's another one who doesn't get the attention he deserves because he was not German. But also, and this is really a fascinating thing, it's because people just don't believe that a great composer can do everything equally well after Mozart. That's really a fact. Beethoven struggled with writing an opera and only churned out one of them. Mozart did everything, right? He wrote operas, he wrote symphonies, he wrote chamber works, he did piano works, he did choral works. Well, his choral works aren't so hot, actually. But basically, to be great at both theatrical music, operatic music, and symphonic music, that's something that's a no-no if you were a German composer after Beethoven. You had to do one or the other. You could not do both. And Dvorak did both. And he did them equally well. And let's just say it and get it out there because he was a fabulous opera composer, even if Rusalka is the only opera anybody really cares about. But there are some other fabulous operas. There's The Jacobin, there's Dimitri, there's The Devil and Kate, there's Armida, there's the Stubborn Peasants, which is a delicious one-act thing. He wrote wonderful, wonderful everythings. He was as great a chamber music composer as anybody in the second half of the 19th century, certainly as great as Brahms, the one we all admire the most. He wrote 12 string quartets, of which 7 or 8 are flat-out masterpieces. He wrote in every possible medium, and as an orchestral composer, he was second to none. His symphonies are as great as Beethoven's and Brahms's. His other orchestral pieces, he wrote overtures and tone poems and suites, and oh my God! And it's not all equally fabulous. It isn't all equally fabulous with Mozart. It just ain't. But it's mostly fabulous, and big chunks of it are fabulous, and he had no limits in what he could do extraordinarily well. He wrote great sacred music. He wrote great choral works. He did everything, just about, let's say. Everything as much as makes no difference. And to that extent, he was the the most versatile and the greatest composer in the second half of the 19th century. And my bitch when it comes to Dvorak is that he doesn't get credit for being that at all. Yes, we love the New World Symphony. We like a couple other symphonies. Yes, we like the American String Quartet. We like little pockets of his music, the Slavonic dances. But there's so much more. To see him whole is the same way you would have to conclude, if you did, that he was as great a musical genius as Mozart or Bach or Beethoven or any of those people. And far more so than any of his contemporaries. Really, really. I mean, the only one who compares to him in quality that way is Tchaikovsky, who is demeaned for much the same reasons as Dvorak is, because he did all of these things. Although Tchaikovsky wasn't a chamber music guy particularly, but he did a bunch of things very well that you weren't supposed to do very well if you were a German composer, which was the standard everybody used to judge. And I know the Germans are sort of being made out to be the bad guys here, but they were in the 19th century, not because they were German, but because it was a period of romantic nationalist bigotry. And that was the aesthetic, the mindset, the intellectual framework that created the analytical models that are still in use today. And so they're not right. They're accurate for the music they were designed to elevate. But they're useless in talking about other kinds of music by other people. And that's one of the big problems we have that scholarship is still wrestling with. Musical scholarship is not always very reflective, in my view, in terms of its origins and its biases. Because at the end of the day, you're talking about what you like and what you don't like. And then you're ex post facto trying to justify what you like and what you don't like as greatness. And that's sort of a, I don't know, questionable thing. Of course, not all scholarship is like that. Not all scholars. There are wonderful musical scholars. I've been privileged to meet quite a few of them who are completely open-minded and unbiased and interested in everything and full of that wide-eyed wonder that I think you really need to do academia well. And so I don't want to be that way. I'm talking in terms of very, very general trends. All right. So last but not least, the most underrated composer ever, and you know who it is. I mean, in the history of humanity, the most important composer who ever existed, Haydn. Absolutely. It's Haydn. It's got to be Haydn. Haydn invented music as we know it. There is nothing that happened in later music by just about anybody that Haydn didn't do or anticipate or set us up for. And the irony, of course, is that Haydn is one of those German composers. He's the one who invented all of the forms and standards and descriptions and the stuff that academia later seized on. The only problem is that Haydn wasn't bound by any of those descriptions, wouldn't have known about them if you told him about them, and his music, as often as not, is completely dismissive of them. He was the most wonderfully imaginative, inventive, freewheeling composer out there. He really was. He was unbelievable. Haydn was also so prolific that it's almost impossible to wrap your brain about what he did, as much as what he did. He was a late bloomer, too. He only really started writing music that we pay attention to in his 20s. His first symphony he wrote when he was nearly 30. But he was the father of the symphony, of the string quartet. And there's so much else. Piano sonatas, piano trios, string trios, lovely early works no one pays attention to. Operas, the choral music, the sacred music is amazing. I mean, it's incredible. And there's tons of it. Okay, we don't have to listen to the baritone trios, which there are, 70, 100, there's 120 something of them, I think, that he wrote for his patron. And, which is, baritone is an instrument that sounds like a dying cow. I mean, so, no matter how fabulous you are, if you're dealing in bovine suffering, you're not going to write music that most people are going to want to listen to more than once. But my goodness, there is no such thing as boring Haydn. None. He just couldn't be dull if he wanted to. And he was so interested in everything around him. He was one of those guys who had that wide-eyed wonder at the world. And he was under no illusions as to his own gifts, as to those of anybody around him. I mean, in some ways, it was the ultimate Enlightenment mentality. It was passionate. It was full of humor. I mean, my God, he's the funniest composer that ever lived. I mean, he could write humorous music. What genius that takes. I can't even begin to describe it. We talked about it a little bit in association with Sullivan. But yeah, the timing, the ability to communicate, to create meaning out of sound, pure sound, funny meaning out of pure sound. Wow. I mean, I'm just aghast at the genius that takes. And there wasn't anybody who approached him. Nobody. There still hasn't been, quite frankly. He was just unbelievably amazing. And we only appreciate a little bit, a tiny bit of what he wrote, and for not always the right reasons, because most people don't appreciate humor. We want to find the sad stuff that he wrote and then compare it to Mozart, who was sadder. I mean, it's like, oh, what a waste of time. Or Beethoven, who was obnoxiouser, who was bigger and blustier and whatever he was, I mean, no. We have to appreciate Haydn for who and what he was, which was just one of the cosmic geniuses in the history of music and one of the most inventive. I mean, he was the Thomas Edison of the classical period. My God, that's got to count for something. And it's got to count for something, not just acknowledging it historically, but in terms of the time you spend listening to his music. Damn it. And so with that, Bitchfest 2022 comes to its lengthy end. I've had a lot to get off my chest this year, and I thank you so much for sticking with me this whole journey. Not just this video, but all of the others that we've accomplished in the past year, and I'm looking forward to the ones upcoming. There's going to be no diminution in what we're doing. Don't worry, I'm going to be here in my new digs. As soon as I get things put away, we're going to get more organized in what I do, but we're still going to do it. And I wish you all the very, very best for 2023 and 4 and 5 and 6, etc., because we are going to retain our sense of wide-eyed wonder at all of this amazing, amazing music that provides an endless source of pleasure and opportunities to share and discover its wonderfulness. Keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.